Hi and welcome to this live Ask Me Anything session. Another live Q&A session that hopefully is interactive, and we have some interesting questions. So please feel free to ask anything like technical or something regarding the Java community or my job as a developer advocate. So as you probably know, I work as a developer advocate mostly for Java for IBM. And I do all kinds of stuff related to enterprise software. And yeah, I'm happy to take your questions. So there's a GitHub repository where you can put something into this issue, or you just ask your questions in the chat. And please feel free to say hi as well in the chat. So just if everything works correctly, like audio and stuff, and if you can hear me. And yeah, I'm very happy to do another one of these events. So I hope all of you are doing fine wherever you are located right now during these crazy times. And yeah, then we could start right away with some questions on the GitHub issue that we got. So we actually have some technical questions. I actually expected just to have some, questions about coffee and motorcycles and whatnot, but we have some questions from my colleague Nicholas. He's awesome. He, by the way, created the Cloud Native Starter project. Maybe you have heard of that, which is very helpful to get started with cloud native technology, with Java, with Quarkus and Kubernetes, all of that to make it manageable. And he is asking about Stack Overflow, how to do basically why, I was a little bit overwhelmed with the question there, or how to, answer properly why to not work it. So the question is about ID tokens with Quarkus. So if you do OIDC, OpenID Connect with Quarkus, then you can include a third-party identity provider, such as Google Login, for example, or some like social login, Google, Facebook, or whatever you have as a developer. You sometimes have this login via Twitter, login via GitHub, and depends on how you use this, either as a as a service or as a web application. You basically get different type of tokens. And he very correctly writes that this is kind of confusing, which I fully agree with. Which type of token you get. So basically, I don't have a proper answer to your question, Nicholas, why why it does not work for that specific service, and whether it is a limitation of microprofile or Quarkus. So the annotation you use in order to inject the token is a microprofile one, but it depends not only on the Quarkus implementation, but actually also on the OpenID Connect provider that you connect to. So for example, what I had, I also recently used this in the project. I had a Google login implementation or connection from Quarkus, and actually it gave me yet another token. It is a web app type of application, so not the service. The difference is, as a service application, you usually don't have an end user interacting with your application directly. It's more like a technical user using some REST resource or some HTTP call, where you provide that token already, that in the first place has to be obtained via a website, a form, redirect to Google, and then redirect back. But with a service type, you already assume that the token is there already, which then usually is an ID token. The difference is, if you're interested in that, I highly recommend to look into JWT tokens. There's some websites that explain it well, and I say this as somebody who is pretty much confused as well. So it is not obvious in the beginning, and my view is that a lot of developers are not quite familiar with that yet. Is that if what was I saying? Yeah, in the service case, you are already providing the identity with that token, and then you get a different one. And in the web application type, as Sergey responds here, you basically you deal with that from the OpenID Connect provider, which then will usually get, depends on what your use case is, an access token. So what I also had an issue with when I was implementing the Google authentication, that it was actually not, I could not inject that JSON web token type directly, because it was a different type internally and then had slightly different information and was using the usual security identity thing is the name of the class. Anyway, what helped me in this case, so it could be a little bit clearer for the documentation. Will actually suggest something there. How this is supposed to be used, or where the difference is. Basically, what helped me a lot was to literally just debug it. This is very easy in Quarkus. You can actually go into your IDE and your project, also if it's like Quarkus code, if it's the application code in dev mode, and then immediately you can step through what's actually happening. It's called authentication mechanism, like OIDC, authentication mechanism in Quarkus, and then you can see what your token looks like. Or, for example, you could set a breakpoint which would be here in the code in your IDE, and then you step through with Quarkus Dev, and then you see it actually what the information is here. I found this actually very helpful. But yeah, it's rather confusing, and I don't know where this issue comes from, depending on the type that you inject. So I'm not sure, on which side it is, but I can say that it also depends on the service provider, which information you get in which case, like how you authenticate towards the provider. That's basically all I could say for that. And let's have a quick look into our chat. Yes, you can hear me loud and clear. Thanks. That's good. Hi as well. And let's continue with the second technical question from Nicholas, or content-related question. When does app modernization make sense and when not? In other words, when should application use cloud-native technologies, and when would it be better to continue using monoliths, either on-prem or in the VM in the cloud? So with the second sentence, I just want to comment that I would not say application modernization has per se something to do with cloud native or with cloud native versus monoliths, because you can very perfectly deploy monolithic type of applications or deployments or architectures into a cloud native setting, as into containerized technologies. Actually, this is a very good use case in order to get up and running into new environments, into new cloud native settings, if you want. If you take an existing application and kind of Dockerize it, containerize it, and then move it to different runtime environments without changing anything else, because usually it works quite well if you were in a Linux-based environment in the past before. To say you have to put some type of effort in order to kind of containerize your application, or in order to put into containers what was on-prem or in VMs before. That is already a good move for a bunch of reasons. And then you can move it into a new environment, which per se doesn't have anything or much to do with app modernization regarding the application. So I would not, first of all, just as a comment, I would not probably mix these terms to say, okay, is application modernization equal to cloud native, equal to versus monoliths or not. I would even say it's more like, orthogonal, or more like a matrix. So either you have, different type of architectures, or you run in VMs or on-prem. For me, there are a few different aspects in here. Because if you use modern approaches, or modern 12-factor like approaches to build applications, you don't per se or necessarily have to come up with a cloud native technologies, but it includes a lot of aspects that really make sense in order to, how can I quickly build my application, how is it reliable, how can I boil down all the moving parts, such as it's easy to reproduce, I can automate it, I don't have to provide the configuration manually, I don't have to create these snowflake servers that are configured in a certain way, and things like that, just in order to be able to move faster. So it's a long-term investment. When does app modernization make sense and when not? That's for me, as a consultant background guy, I have to say, well, it depends, of course, right? So, Basically, I understand the question as follows: when does it make sense to modernize an application versus rewrite it from scratch? So that's at least what I understand here. So then I would say, well, it depends how much. First of all, how much value, not value is the wrong word, how much complicated stuff is in the application that cannot be rewritten in a quick or easy way, right? Like if it really does some sophisticated algorithms or things like that, like at least in the core business logic that cannot easily be extracted. For example, if it's deeply entangled with some legacy framework where you cannot say, okay, you move from something like JEE5 or JEE6, which is written in such a way, at least if you stick to the standards, that you can extract the business logic from your Java code quite easily, or just put different annotations on them, or put it into a different context, and then you can migrate it to a new runtime, such as a Jakarta E8 with a modern application server, or use things like Quarkus, for example, where you don't have to rewrite or throw away a lot of your code. If that is the case, so basically if your existing application code allows a somewhat simpler modernization without rewriting big things from scratch, then I would say it's, from experience, it probably makes sense to look at it just from an effort perspective. So that's basically what I would answer. It really depends from case by case, but in general, I would try to assess and compare the efforts, right? Like how much effort do you see in migrating something to a Java 9 plus, so for example, Java JDK 14, based on whatever runtime you have, if it's an enterprise application, for example, OpenLiberty, for example, Quarkus, or if it's a Spring Boot app or something like that. How much effort does that take versus rewriting it, plus the surrounding applications or all the services that take part in that system from scratch, right? So including especially all the runtimes and configuration, because this is typically where the devil is in the detail, to say, okay, it's, even if the code is quite easy to migrate, then maybe you had some custom libraries that were part of one legacy runtime that now doesn't exist or works differently. So this is typically, from experience, the pitfalls that you might experience. Yes, other than that, I don't know quite how to answer this general question in a more particular or in a better way. But this is kind of my take on it. Like, look at it from these perspectives, and in general, there are a lot of aspects behind cloud native technologies and 12-factor apps and all these modern ways. How to do DevOps, how to build modern applications, especially with backend applications that make sense, and when to apply them or how to apply them in a way that it works with the existing applications. I think that's what I would answer. All right, now if you didn't fall asleep already from my rant here, I'll take some questions from the chat. Next, I'll just read them out here. Hi, seeing how many events you do attend and how many, well, not right now, right? And how many things you do for your community, I raise a question: how much time do you actually spend of devish stuff beside work hours? How do you prevent a burnout? Wow, that's a very good question, especially the burnout part. Tackling that first, the burnout part, I might want to quote smart person, Cliff Click, who actually wrote the Hotspot VM, who said, quote unquote, "I need coding to save my soul." And I really can, I can double down on that. Actually, the devish part, the development part, and the coding part is the part that really gives some, I would say, some sanity, some nice flow experience especially during these crazy times. So I found out, especially in the during some lockdown that we had here in Central Europe, that it helped a lot to just code on some, whether it's work related or after working hours on some side project, to code on some stuff, to write some Java code or any type of code, to just not get crazy and preventing yourself from burnout. How I manage that with the time and with balancing the time, well, it depends. So when I have another question on that I got on the issue via email, via DM, how a typical day looks like. So it really depended when I was traveling around for events. That then typically, traveling takes a lot of time and you're on the road and something like that. So during these times, I was just preparing the events and my presentations and all these more urgent things, mostly during my day. And now, while I'm working from home, I cannot really specify a percentage, but it's more than 50%. So actually quite a lot. Even if it's just, like working on some examples and other demo projects where I actually code a lot and, try out a lot of stuff. I also try out actually always very new modern versions on some like software, usually latest Java versions, and then latest versions of Quarkus, of Liberty, and all things like that, where you actually run into a lot of like early issues that then you can submit, which gives you a lot of really deep level development stuff, because you sometimes have to debug into how things actually work. So it's very, very technical, and I really like it that way. So at least for my role or what I'm currently doing, it definitely does not go into a management or type of marketing type of role, which is really good for me. I like the technical part. I like coding. I like being a developer, and that's where I'm happy. So that's a good question, and yeah, it's basically. I could not directly name a percentage how much I spend, on actual coding. Besides all the fluff around, it's a lot of Twitter marketing, and then sometimes creating some more abstract learning paths first, and then of course communicating with colleagues and being in meetings and all that. But it's definitely more than 50% on the actual work, which is good for me. All right. Another technical question in the chat. Hi Sebastian, can you share some best practices about REST API versioning, like some ideas how to solve that technically in a container orchestration context? Thank you. Yes, well, best practices about REST API versioning. How to solve that technically. So that is the first thing I would a little bit poke at to say. It really depends where it makes sense to put some versioning into your API if you actually do want to solve it technically, or first of all, think of it from a more use case or business, if you want, a driven perspective of saying, what does versioning actually mean? So in a few times in my workshops, I said, well, actually do not version, please, or do not at least make breaking changes to an existing API. And for a lot of business applications, then versioning doesn't really make sense from a perspective that you said, okay, is it what are you actually providing here in this API? Is it not valid anymore, what you provided before, or is it now just a different type of representation of your use cases, right? Like of your domain models and things like that. For example, if your use cases already existed in the past and now something changed. So if you have breaking changes, then first of all, why would you want breaking changes? Why won't you want your users to be unhappy, right? To experience something like that. So versioning is an easy answer to say, well, then we don't change anything. We just provide a new version on top of it. But that doesn't really solve the problem. If you think about okay, what does the new version actually provide? What is now different? Did something change that the old version or existing clients would need to take into consideration as well, or did only the representation change? So for best practices, first of all, I would look into what is called content negotiation, where you say you provide the content type, such as application JSON, and you can actually extend that with versions if you want. If you say, okay, this is a different representation, it does not mean you providing a different thing. It's a different representation of the same resource. So this is a very precise meaning of RESTful communication here, that you're representing a resource, for example, a coffee order, in a specific format, for example, JSON. You could represent the same coffee order. It's like it's a model on top of an actual thing, like the actual coffee. that you could model in JSON or XML or something else. And then, you could provide different information. You could provide more or less fields and things like that. Which I would look into it first, content negotiation, that's the word, which then does not involve any different routing or something like that. It's basically done on the server based on which accept or content type header you send with. And other than that, well, what container or orchestration technology could do for you is it then a different routing to say, okay, if you do a versioning such as you append to your URL like /v1, v2, things like that, and now route this here, route this there, which actually I would avoid, first of all, if you can, for a bunch of reasons, mostly business use case related, to think about and say, okay, what does it actually mean, v1? Especially if you're very strict from a REST perspective, if you really want to get the semantics, very correctly, following the book to say, okay, a URL represents a resource, and a different URL is a different resource, right? If you have a coffee order 1, 2, 3, that's different to 2, 3, 4. And then if you say, okay, v1 / coffee order, then it's a different kind of order than v2 / the same coffee order, right? Which is not the case. It's the same resource. So that already doesn't quite make sense to put it into the resource path to be very strict or precise if you want. It also boils down in which environment you are. Like if you control the client or if you could upgrade the clients within your control, or if they're just, can arbitrarily use your API, which is usually the case in the web. So in general, I would just, make sure first of all, and there's some means to do that, to not change anything that makes an existing client break within keeping the same paths. For example, hypermedia is something to look at that might help you there. And that is basically, as a best practice, what I would look at. And then content negotiation for different representations and just some keywords for that. I hope that helps for this this question. All right. We have another question in the chat on which I actually have to search something. So top 5 books I can recommend as a Java developer. And now I have to look into something. Yes, I knew it was in a newsletter. So if you don't get my newsletter, it comes totally for free. Just go on my website, sebastian-no/news. And it was, more than 2 years ago that I said, okay, reading books, my personal favorite books. I knew I was sharing something like that. So this goes to Twitter, of course. Yes. So my top 3, and I think they are still true. Domain-driven design. This is definitely a recommendation for software developers in general. To understand, like how to model whatever you want to solve from a business perspective. It's not a quite easy read if you get the actual book. There are also distilled versions, but I found it very beneficial, and probably one of the best IT books, like as a programmer at least, or from a developer's perspective, to read. Effective Java is another really good one for Java, of course, specifically. Continuous Delivery. This is in general a really good book for if you work in IT, and actually just a must read if you build any systems. Probably still my top 3 on what I shared back then. I don't know if there are more in this newsletter. Other than that, actually don't know if I had yet a newer tweet about the topic, but on top of my head I can say Java by Comparison is another really nice book that actually shows side by side some difference of some code to say, okay, especially if you're starting out, or if you don't have developed a good eye for why is some code better or cleaner as some other. It shows side by side to say, hey, look, you have this code and that very same code, but just refactored. Which version would you prefer and for which reason? And then it really helps you to develop somewhat a sense for a cleaner code to say, okay, actually this makes a lot of sense for these and these reasons. Java by Comparison. And or actually I can type it right in. Reason for you. This is this one, Java by Comparison. Yes. this one. That is a recommended read. The other one is, it's also similar to Continuous Delivery. It's the book Release It! Exclamation mark. There has been a new version that is just about, well, deployment in general and how to run actually production stuff. With a lot of interesting war stories about things that can go wrong, especially also very interesting for Java developers, and just a really nice read that I found. What I was reading right now is oh god, what's the name? Data applications, not data driven. I think it's called data intense, something like that, or designing data intensive applications. That is another recommended read, which I really enjoyed. I learned a lot about databases and in general, about consistency and distributed systems. So that's a really, really good one as well. And I think, well, that's already more than 5. These are definitely ones I can read. I can recommend from the top of my head. Yeah. So if you threw them, then just let me know. And apparently I shared something else here. Oh, yes. Yeah, Effective Java. Oh, Clean Code. Yeah, that's more perennial seller. Functional Programming in Java by Venkat Subramaniam. Especially interesting for Java 8 and everything that lambdas and well, functional programming introduced here. So these ones as well. Yeah, that's probably what I would. Not probably, that's what I can recommend. These are really, really good ones, especially for Java developers. All right, so if you have more questions regarding that, please put it into the chat. And got some more questions in the GitHub issue. So by email, and actually I got this question a lot: how do you become a Java champion? So yes, a Java champion, if you don't know that, is a recognition, or actually it is a recognition that is sponsored by Oracle, but it's not, well, it's not employed or paid by Oracle. It's just like an independent group of Java luminaries, of people who care about the Java ecosystem, or as I like to explain it, people who somewhat move the Java ecosystem forward. So this is a small group of, I think we're now at a little bit more than 300 Java, not only Java developers, but Java luminaries, or people who move the Java ecosystem forward in some way, where those people, and I'm one of them, were recognized for like how they moved Java forward in some way. So now I said this a few times. So that's basically how I think about it, because it's not necessarily something technical. So first of all, you cannot apply somewhere. You cannot fill out just a form. You're just recognized, and usually you don't know upfront that you've been given this title, and it is about, well, as I said, not only something technical, but how to move the Java ecosystem forward. It can be by organizing and starting a huge community. It can be by organizing a successful Java event or a Java conference. Well, maybe not right now, but maybe something online, something virtual. Most Java champions, as far as I could see, are somewhat technical, by being technical luminaries and by sharing that knowledge and leading by examples. For example, by leading and starting a Java user group, by helping others, by teaching, by creating examples, by advocating Java in general, and for example, providing some teaching material, how to get started, how to get better as a developer, whatever you could imagine that somewhat helps the Java ecosystem. So this is a recognition. And how to become one? Well, what I always say, if you want to be a Java champion, then first of all, I would ask, like, why do you want to become a Java champion? So just that it's in your resume, that's probably not a good motivation. But I think the best way to become one is to not care about the title and just do something positive for the Java ecosystem because you want to anyway, right? So that's always the best, I think, the best motivation, because you care about the technology, maybe because it's just fun to program and to share that knowledge and to share your journey and what you learned yourself. So this is how I always looked at it, is to say, okay, look, today I learned something new which I did not know before, and I struggled learning that while on this journey, right? Like sometimes it's just annoying if you spend 2 hours on debugging a small problem, or like finding out something which could be easier, and then sharing that knowledge. Because I was always like, if it helped me, then there is a non-zero chance that it helps somebody else as well. And then if I share it and that other person sees it before spending those 2 hours themselves, then it's already beneficial, right? That's already, you did a good thing, kind of. And actually, and I said this before as well many times, many more times than I would like to admit, I wrote something on my blog, and then, years afterwards, I searched for the same problem, and I actually ended up on my own blog with a blog post where I was like, oh, yes, I wrote this. I didn't even remember. And to be honest, this actually recently happened to me like 1 or 2 weeks ago with something, I think it was for Jack Soros or for Jason B, something like that, where I just, again, found a blog post after Googling a problem. And, there was the solution. So it's not only for being altruistic and helping others, it's also for helping yourself and enabling yourself in sharing knowledge, just out of the sheer, like fun and the ambition to learn yourself, because teaching is a really good way of learning. So that is mostly the technical perspective of what's behind a Java champion. So it's not only being technical. There are some actually even non-technical people or less technical people who are Java champions who maybe organize the conference or something like that. So it really just depends. But I would not do it for the sheer title or accomplishment or recognition, but actually just for the journey itself. And then if you get some type of recognition or maybe something else, a good job, maybe there's some other titles, like there's some IBM developer champions, there's some Oracle sponsored other programs who are closer to specific company technology. So there are a lot of cool recognitions and programs out there who try to encourage people to do that and to share knowledge just because they want to, not because they're forced to. And I think that's just a cool thing. And I really like to be part of the Java community, and that's just my take on it. So that's basically my answer to the question, like how to become a Java champion or why. All right, we got another question in the chat. Using event sourcing. So I like this event there. We have a lot of different questions and backgrounds now. One on CQRS. Using event sourcing with CQRS, have you ever built up your query service read model in memory? Yes, I have. It can make a lot of sense if you need to scale up your read side really quickly, where you say, you have many reservices, for example, or you really don't care about, throwing that away. Maybe you don't even have a database or a specific one on the read side, and you just want to serve your queries really quickly. Yes. Or should the read model always have to be persistent in some kind of DB storage? No, it does not have to be persistent. It really depends what you're trying to do. In many ways, it makes sense, especially if you say, okay, you need to maybe restart something like that, or your read model. But especially in cloud-native settings where you have containerized applications, you might not even have a persistent read model, or at least not all the time, right? Especially once you're starting out. For example, you're starting out with some CQRS architecture, and then once you have the event store persistent, I mean, that's super important because that's the golden source of truth in that system. But then maybe also to get started to say, okay, you know what, the first version of my read service is not persistent, and we just spin up multiple instances of it, and they're all in memory. What is the downside? Well, the downside is then they always have to compute them on the fly. So once they start up, they basically have to do a lot of work and maybe request all of the events again if you don't have snapshots in your event store. And then it's more work to be done at startup, but it's also easier and you save your database. So it might make sense. And the more you advance, then you might include snapshots on your read model as well, or a different store that makes more sense how your query service is modeled. So yeah, there are definitely different versions available, which we have used in projects. So whatever makes sense here, but there are no strict rules on that side at least. But your event store is definitely has to be persisted. Is changing jobs companies once per year a bad reputation in the eyes of recruiters? That's another question. Nowadays, this field is so dynamic. Yes, so I'm probably not a good person to ask that because, well, I've been self-employed for for many years before I got employed now as a developer advocate, which is now almost 2 years ago. It was November 2018 when I started for working for IBM. But it's also probably not, a very stable or usual developer role, being a developer advocate, especially with this. Well, before the pandemic, it was a very like global role, like traveling around all the time, right? I would. It's a good question. If it's a bad reputation in the eyes of recruiters, I would say it depends more on the individual story, like why were you changing jobs, or what was the basically what was the story behind it, because some recruiters might say, okay, was it actually because it never worked out because we have a difficult type of person here or something like that. But again, I really cannot comment on that, because if you're a freelancer and if you're a contractor, which I worked, then typically my projects were at most half a year for a client, or even shorter. But that's just sometimes the nature of being a freelancer. And for me, this was always voluntarily to say, okay, I actually want to change this many times just to learn something new. And usually after a lot of months, you kind of get used to the technology, and then you helped a lot already, and then it's time to move on or something like that. It depends, but also I would not take jobs in general just for for the sake of having a nice CV, right? It's like what you do in life in general, right? Like, should you go on a 1 year sabbatical, or does it look bad in your CV? So it's like, it's your life. So if you really want to do it, like, who cares if it looks bad or good in your CV? Or the other way around, if a company does not take you based solely on or want to hire you solely on your history, or how well it looks, then it's another question if you really want to work there. And as a developer, you can say that because of the position that we're in the industry, that we really can choose the place where we would like to work. So if it's a bad reputation, well, to be honest, I don't know. Depends probably on how the rest of the history looks like. But I would in general always choose jobs on how much you can learn, how much you can contribute, how much you can help. Really, is there value given from you and coming towards you, where you can actually make the world better and you improve yourself? And this is mostly what counts, and especially also with regards to how long you work somewhere, because this changes over time. So this is how I would look at it, but I'm really not, I would say, the best person to ask that question. As a consultant, you can change your project often at different clients, yes, typically. But I also, knew consultants who have been at the same clients for 10 years, although they were external. So yeah, it depends, I guess. But it's a good question, indeed. All right. Then another one in the GitHub issue, and I got by DM. How does your day as a developer advocate for IBM look like? Yes, so that again really depends. If you would have asked me that question 4 months ago or 5 months ago, I could give you a better answer, because now it's pretty much well, the same. So let me answer first before the pandemic, because I was traveling a lot, and actually really a lot. For me, that was by choice, because I was really always grateful to be enabled to work as a developer advocate for IBM, and to be able to travel to clients and the Java community all around the globe, to speak at conferences, to visit meetups. So it really depended on what type of day it was, right? So if it's a travel day, then it really depends. If you've done some like business related traveling, you probably know what I'm talking about. Like sometimes you just spend the whole day like somewhere or some lounges or in some hotels or whatever, and then you just what I did a lot, just trying to be productive, like making the best out of every situation. And sometimes you can work really well in airplanes if it's quiet, or in some hotel lobby or a hotel room, or you can stroll around wherever you happen to be and find a nice coffee shop or something like that, and then try to prepare whatever is up next. So a lot of days were like that, especially when it comes to conferences or some meetups or some events that are there. Then I typically try to at least see a little bit of the city or the place where I'm wherever I happen to be, and then prepare like the content, and then visit conference, meetup, client, or whatever. So there was a lot of days like this. Then the quite the opposite, because I work remotely, or actually from home, and also not just now but also before, because all of our team members are basically working remotely or working from somewhere. So the rest of my team is based in the US, but also in totally different places. So it really doesn't matter, or it doesn't make sense whether you are in an office. Other than that, their IBM office is literally all around the world, so in almost every major city. But I just work remotely, so then it's a very quiet setup. I have my work environment here like I need it, in a very like perfectly ordered manner, how I can work in the most productive way. And this is really helpful if you need to prepare some new content, if you need to look into some new material, if you read some like technical books or some documentation, reading about new concepts. So doing really this deep work type of work, where a lot of days were like this, where you can really structure your day how you are the most effective with. You can actually listen to my podcast, The Effective Developer. I think I announced that before. You can find it on my blog as well, where I was just talking about like how you can structure your day if you work from home. So a lot of days were like this, and then sometimes just going on some in-person meetings with colleagues, or going to a client as well, but that's basically like traveling. So it's basically between these two extremes, or that was the case up until March. And now it's only the latter. So basically since March, I'm just been stuck in a single place, and I haven't stepped into a plane not a single time, which is quite a big change. So yeah, now I just like work remotely all the time. I only do like online or remote content, like remote presentations, producing a lot of videos and blog posts and materials like that. So it's a lot of creating content like this, and at the same time learning about new things. I also, do some client work, and I still do some work outside of IBM, which is actually also a good thing for my role as a developer advocate as well, just to see, like a different perspective every now and then, and help out for some other projects and some other clients. So it's some type of balance involved here as well, and that's how a typical like day looks like here. And the second part of that question, since you are a coffee lover, what is your favorite coffee drink? So that depends on, well, I would say time of the day. So actually, I love all kinds of coffee and ways to make coffee. So I like, like just a plain espresso, also with milk, cappuccino, a type of drink. I love filter coffee, pour over. French press also as well, but usually I love more like the traditional hand brewed filter approach. I usually like coffee beans, if you're into coffee, like beans that are more like fruity or floral taste, that taste, like a little bit sweeter if you want. I always drink my coffee without sugar actually, and I like beans that are not roasted that dark. So in any modern hipster like third wave coffee shop, you could potentially like find me tasting and trying out some coffee. I love coffee like in all kinds of sorts. At home I also bought quite some coffee equipment. So I have a barista like coffee machine where I can make some espresso and cappuccino and things like that. So I usually start my day with something that has milk in it, like a cappuccino or some. I also do the bulletproof type of coffee. You can Google that. That sounds a little bit weird at the beginning, but just to drink something not on an empty stomach, I think that's just better to start the day, and that's basically my thing. But other than that, basically all kinds of coffee, at least if it's like has some nice fruity taste or some nice variety of taste. So I'm not a big fan of very dark roast. So usually like a light roast where I can actually taste the actual bean, the actual taste. All right, and that's pretty much it with our live session. We have two more questions in the chat, and then I think we're done also with the time. Wow, a lot of questions here. How to manage multi-tenancy in Node SQL database. Wow, this is a little bit too broad and generic, that question, to be honest, because it really depends on your use case on your database. I mean, I recently in a project implemented multi-tenancy as in like multi-users, but it was more like one user per almost database or schema, like in Neo4j, which is a graph database, which technically is a NoSQL database. So I would ask that question. I'm sorry, I really cannot give you an answer here because it really depends, like which database, what type of NoSQL database, like graph or document oriented database, and especially which implementation or which database actually, because they implement it differently. I would say there is no kind of like standard way, to be honest. Really depends on your use case, and I can say this because in that Neo4j example we had like a use case where we used Neo4j node labels to represent like a different tenant, like a different user, and then used some code injection to find out that user and automatically go towards the correct schema or part of the database if you want. But that really depends. So yes, I cannot really be more precise with that question. I hope that helps. How do you implement messaging in projects? Maybe Kafka or message-driven bean, and which use case is best for each or one technology? Another kind of broad question. Yes, so how do you implement messaging in projects? And maybe Kafka. So that's actually a good way to start, because before you would go into these technical details, and I got this question, these type of questions as well a lot, I would roll back a few steps and ask, okay, wait a second, what are you trying to do? Like, why do you need messaging? What is the point here? What are the use cases? Do you need this asynchronous way of communication, or what is your user interaction or your use case in general? I wrote about this in a deeper way in my book. Well, it's actually about Java EE, but has this type of communication form in as well. So this is a question I would ask first, like what is the business use case and the type of communication you need? And with type of communication, I mean, is it synchronous or asynchronous from a business perspective, right? So if, for example, a user puts in some order, does the user immediately have to get a response whether the full order processing did work, or is it fine to tell the user, okay, thanks, come back later, and then you do some processing in the background, but it doesn't have to be technically asynchronous. You can do plain synchronous HTTP call to do all of this ping pong back and forth, and then you don't have to have a like messaging as in a message driven solution there, or in an event driven solution. So it really depends what you're trying to do that, and I am asking these questions as a consultant in projects all the time, because sometimes people are just trying to solve a random or any problem with just throwing more technology at it, when you can say, hey, wait a second, can we solve this in a simpler way, or in a somewhat different way? And in general, I would always go with the more simpler solution, even if it means having technically synchronous calls, at least as long as you can live with it, just because it makes things easier. Then it a little bit depends on the project background with the technology, because, for example, I see a lot of enterprise projects where they already have some JMS backing solutions, for example, some like IBM queues or whatnot in the project, where it's actually easier to leverage that, because also the devil lays in the detail here in the infrastructure. It's easier on the code side to say, hey, we just include some messaging pipelining, some messaging infrastructure, but who runs these infrastructures, right? And how persistent does it have to be? So especially that part. What about consistency? What about, if we lose a message, can we lose a message? What about do we need idempotent consumers on this part? What if this part fails? What if that part fails? So fails to send or produce a message, and then what about the consumption of the part? Do you have something like a dead letter queue, and how to monitor it and all these things? So there, I would say, much more questions to be asked and to be answered before we go into the actual technology and what to choose. So looking at a little bit of the project perspective, what really makes sense here, I would say. Other than that, yeah, that's basically the best advice I can give you. Look into the details, especially when it comes to consistency and losing versus not losing messages, and then you already I think are quite busy with answering these parts and how to solve them just from a conceptual perspective already, without going into do we choose A and B. If you chose A or B, then it probably makes sense to use a solution that's either managed or already existing by some IT infrastructure, like an already existing queue deployment or something like that, or a managed Kafka or something like that, depending on your environment. All right, that's pretty much all the questions, and we're also already above the 45 minutes that I usually take for these live Q&A sessions. So I hope it was helpful. I hope it was interesting to watch. I'm really happy to always get some questions and interactions, especially in this time where we all are just somewhat remote, and whichever situation you happen to be, I think it's just good to connect and interact a little bit. And I hope you enjoy these type of sessions. If you have some other questions, always feel free to reach out, or you can actually put something into this GitHub repository, or actually open up a new issue even. And then we see what, if you have some questions, what we do with it. And I'm happy to hear your feedback as well. And other than that, I hope you all are doing well and staying safe. And thanks a lot for watching. Bye-bye.